Hello, good morning, everyone. Let's continue where we left off. Last time we talked about um, how a cell adapts to to changes in the external environment, and it does this through a series of reversible changes known as cellular adaptations. Now, um, for this session, we're going to talk about what happens when the cell is not able to adapt fully to stresses brought about by external stimuli. Now, as a review, we know that um, a cell is exposed to different external stresses. This can be due to increased workloads, increased demand, physical or chemical stimuli, and it the cells, the tissues in the body trying to maintain homeostasis through a series of reversible reversible changes, which we talked about last time, and this is known as adaptation. Now, if the cell is unable to adapt, the cell becomes injured. Now, in some cases, the stimuli can be the degree of the stimulation can be so uh, ca- uh, can be such that the cell does not have enough time to adapt, in which case the cell cannot adapt and the cell becomes injured. Now, if um, the injury is not that great, or if the injury takes place over a long period of time, then injury is said to be reversible, and this gives time for the cell to repair itself. And as a result, the cell goes back to normal. However, if the injury is so severe or if the injury is persistent, thereby giving the cell no time to repair itself, then it undergoes two possibilities. Either the tissue repairs itself, but with diminished capacity. The end result is that you will have a cell that can no longer function to its fullest capacities, or the injury becomes irreversible, ultimately leading to cell death, whether it is through necrosis or apoptosis. The two major cell types of cell death, which we'll be talking about later. Now, cell injury is when the cell is exposed to an injurious stimuli, and um, cell injury is a result of a failure of cellular adaptation. Cellular injury is reversible up to a certain extent, but if the stimulus is so severe or if the stimulus is persistent, then the cell reaches a point of no return. It damages certain organelles, and upon a certain point at which these organelles are damaged, the cell can no longer be able to repair itself, and as a result, the cell dies. There are different types of cell death. We have four or five, and even in newer books, you will see seven. But for the most part, we'll be limiting ourselves to two major types of cell death: necrosis and apoptosis. Necrosis is the type of cell death that occurs due to injury, and it can also be due to a failure of blood supply. And we learned about this term last time. This is known as ischemia. Necrosis is always pathologic. So think of necrosis as the cell being lysed. Okay, we will talk about the specific mechanisms later on, but essentially in necrosis, the membrane slice. So as a result, you will have no um, you will have no nuclear membrane. The nucleus is not distinct. The cell membrane, the plasma membrane ultimately lyses, so you will have blebs on the cell. Ultimately, the cell will burst. Okay, so that's necrosis. That's how a necrotic cell will look like. Um, Apoptosis is another type of cell death, and this is known as programmed cell death. Whereas necrosis is lysis, w- uh, apoptosis apoptosis is when um, a cell that has been programmed to die packages itself, condenses itself, so that it can easily be gobbled up by WBCs and phagocytes. Okay? Whereas necrosis is always pathologic, apoptosis can be physiologic or pathologic, and we'll find that out later why that's the case. Now, there are different kinds of cellular injury, and we'll be talking about these causes um, for the next few slides. The most common cause of cellular injury is hypoxia. Okay, hypoxia is when there is decreased oxygen supply to a cell or a tissue or an organ, and there are different means or different ways by which a cell may have decreased oxygen. Okay, Um, one cause for hypoxia is a phenomenon called ischemia, and ischemia is basically due to obstruction of blood flow. Okay, there may be adequate amounts of oxygen in the environment, but when there is poor delivery of oxygen by blood to a certain organ, then of course the cell is going to become hypoxic. And when the hypoxia is brought about by decreased blood flow, arterial blood flow to an organ or a tissue, then that is termed ischemia. Okay. Another cause of hypoxia is when there is inadequate oxygenation of the blood. There is proper blood flow. Blood can flow through the different organs, but there is poor oxygenation of the blood. An example is lung disease. Okay, so when there is poor exchange of gases in the lungs and there is decreased amount of oxygen being delivered through the lungs into the blood, or when there is toxicity of certain gases. Okay, a very common source of toxicity is carbon monoxide, which is an odorless, colorless gas. I've mentioned this before, but you've seen this in movies where homeless people sleep in their vehicles with the windows rolled up, air conditioning is on, and there's something wrong with the engine, leading to poor combustion. So carbon monoxide is produced. The problem with carbon monoxide is it binds to the hemoglobin molecule more avidly than oxygen. So as a result, oxygen will be competing with carbon monoxide. And in all cases, carbon monoxide almost always wins. So as a result, oxygen cannot bind to the hemoglobin molecule. And therefore, even when there is adequate circulation, there's decreased amount of oxygen being delivered to the tissue because oxygen is being edged out by carbon monoxide. Okay? Another reason for hypoxia, and this is also fairly common, is a condition known as anemia. Please note that anemia is not a disease. Anemia is not a single disease. It is a manifestation of so many other diseases. Okay? Anemia is not a specific condition, it's not a specific manifestation. There are lots of diseases that can cause anemia. Iron nutritional deficiencies, for example, like iron, vitamin B12, folate, they can cause anemia. Rapid blood loss, rapid or chronic blood loss can cause anemia. Um, Malignancies and certain infections can cause anemia. Okay, certain conditions like cancers, bone marrow problems, these can cause anemia as well. Whatever the cause of, whatever the cause behind the anemia, this results in poor, low levels of hemoglobin, and as a result, since we know that hemoglobin carries oxygen towards the different parts of the body, of course, you're going to have decreased delivery of oxygen to the different parts. Okay, and another cause for oxygen deficiency is inadequate perfusion. So blood isn't being circulated very efficiently throughout the body. So this can be seen in hypotension, shock, heart failure. Okay? So depending on the degree of the hypoxia, cells may have time to adapt, okay, thereby minimizing injury. However, as I've mentioned, in some cases, cells do not have time to adapt or the injurious stimuli may be so severe that cells do not have the time to adapt, and therefore cells undergo injury and ultimately cell death. Okay. Other causes of cellular injury will be physical agents like trauma, chemical agents like burns, radiation, extremes in temperature, electric shock. So they can cause cellular injury either through um, coagulation of proteins, um, actual trauma, physical trauma to the cells, etc., etc. Chemical agents, drugs, and poisons can also cause cellular injury. So, for example, cyanide messes with the mitochondria. Okay, lead, um, lead toxicity interferes with a lot of enzymes in the cells. Okay, so that can cause injury as well. Infectious agents, I think that goes without saying. And depending on the infectious agent, you're going to have different etiologies of pathogenesis of the disease. There are some conditions as well wherein the body attacks its own cells. This is known as autoimmunity. So we see that in autoimmune diseases like systemic lupus erythematosus or lupus or SLE, wherein the immune system attacks um, its own DNA. You also have Hashimoto's disease, where autoimmune antibodies attack the thyroid. Okay. You also have infections that um, stimulate the production of autoantibodies, like, for example, certain streptococcal infections. Okay. Genetic derangements and nutritional imbalances also cause cellular injury. Now, how does cell injury cause damage? Depending on what type of injury causes what is the mechanism of the injury, you're going to have different mechanisms as well. Hypoxia, in general, causes the depletion of ATP. Okay, we know that um, majority of the energy in the body is actually used up by the sodium potassium pump and the maintenance of ionic gradients across membranes within the cell. Okay, and to produce that energy, the mitochondria produces ATP molecules through a process known as oxidative phosphorylation. Now, if oxygen is not enough, then of course oxidative phosphorylation will not commence. And as a result, the reactions, the structures within the cell that are reliant on ATP will of course be affected. Okay, and um, these functions that will be affected are generally membrane-bound are processes found in the membrane-bound organelles. Okay, now one of the effects, of course, is the inability of the sodium-potassium pump to function. Normally, sodium, because it's found extracellularly, has a tendency to go inside the cell. Potassium is found in more abundant concentrations inside the cell, and it has a tendency to leak outside the cell. Okay, that's the natural tendency by virtue of their concentrations. The problem is sodium, by virtue that sodium usually goes together with water. If sodium is going to come inside the cell, it's going to drag water molecules inside the cell as well. This causes the cell to swell and ultimately to burst. We don't want that, so the cell actually has a mechanism of throwing sodium molecules out, and together with sodium, water is going to be kicked out as well. And this maintains the normal osmotic gradients of the cells. However, if the sodium potassium pump is damaged because of depletion of ATP, then sodium is going to rush into the cells, causing the cells to swell and to burst. Okay? Another mechanism of cellular injury is through mitochondrial damage. Again, the mitochondria has membranes, and for it to function properly, for the electron transport chain to function properly, then it is reliant on the integrity of this membrane. Okay. Now, if there's something wrong with the ATP producing machinery of the cell, then the mitochondrial membranes will be compromised, and this will cause the electron transport chain to be affected as well. Okay, so as a result, the mitochondria will not be able to produce um, adequate amounts of ATP, thereby causing a vicious cycle leading to further damage in the cell. Okay. Another mechanism by which mitochondrial damage can cause cellular injury is through the leakage of um, pro-apoptotic proteins. Okay, there are proteins within the mitochondria that, when it is leaked out into the cytosol, will actually trigger cell death. Okay, now ribosomal damage, um, as a result of cellular swelling, can also cause cellular injury because um, there will be decreased production of the proteins that will be needed to repair the cell and for the cell to function properly. So this adds to the damage. Nuclear and DNA damage also causes cellular injury because when the cell detects that there is DNA damage, it will also facilitate um, destruction of the cell. This is actually a defense mechanism within the cell to prevent mutations from taking place. Okay, so when the cells detect that there is damage within DNA, it will actually try to destroy itself. Okay, influx of intracellular calcium due to cellular swelling and compromise of the plasma membrane can also lead to cellular damage because calcium is an potent enzyme activator. Okay, the activation of enzymes due to the influx of calcium will trigger the activation of enzymes leading to further cell damage. Okay, now let's talk about free radical injury because this is something that this is a term that we've all been exposed to, but we're not really very sure as to how free radicals cause damage. Now, the term free radicals are basically reactive oxygen species. So basically, these are oxygen molecules that have free electrons. And generally, when there are free electrons in a molecule, basically this means that it's very capable of reacting with other substances. It's a very reactive um, substance. Okay, and once these free radicals interact with lipids in the plasma membranes, they actually cause peroxidation of lipid membranes, causing the destruction of these membranes. Okay, now these free radicals are generated over time, and they are usually a product of normal metabolism. Number one, it's a normal byproduct of the chemical reactions in the body. Number two, radiation injury, exposure to certain chemicals, um, exposure to oxygen when the cells are damaged because the salvage mechanism of the cells um, to counteract or to process oxygen is damaged. It cannot utilize oxygen properly during oxidative phosphorylation. It produces a lot of these free radicals because the mitochondria is damaged in these cells. Um, in inflammatory states, the neutrophils produce reactive oxygen species and transition metals or metals that have multiple valence states, okay, like iron, copper, etc., etc. Now, common free radicals in the body include superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, hydroxyl ions, and nitric oxide. Okay. Now, as mentioned, they cause damage to certain molecules in the body. Lipids in the membranes, they cause peroxidation, so masisira yung membranes, and as a result, the cell slice, okay, the organelle slice. Number two, they also cause damage to proteins by causing oxidative modification, leading to coagulation of the proteins and fragmentation. And they also cause DNA damage leading to mutations and malignant transformation. So how does our body fight free radicals? Of course, there are exogenous substances that we take in known as antioxidants. And there are also intracellular mechanisms, intracellular enzymes that fight these entities, and these include catalase, superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and mannitol. Okay, so this is essentially a diagram or summary of everything that we've talked about in the last slide. Now, so this is a schema or a summary of our explanation of cellular injury as a review. So hypoxia causes a decrease in oxidative phosphorylation, which causes decreased ATP. This leads to membrane damage and proton pump failure in the mitochondria. This causes a positive feedback, leading to further decrease in ATP. This also leads to a loss of ion gradient. Sodium is going to rush in, causing the cell to swell and leading to further damage to the integrity of the plasma membrane. As a result, calcium is going to rush into the cell, leading to the activation of enzymes and digestion of the cell. Okay. As a result of decreased oxidative phosphorylation, the cell is also going to shift to glycolysis, less energy efficient, but it produces a lot of acids, particularly lactic acid. Lactic acid also contributes to the damage of the organelles, especially of the mitochondria. Damage to the mitochondria releases calcium and other um, pro-apoptotic molecules, which further contributes to cell damage and death. Okay. Now, as mentioned, cellular injury can be reversible or irreversible. But the question is, when is that line? When is that boundary? When when injury to the cell is still reversible, and when is injury to the cell irreversible? Okay. If there is swelling of the cell to a certain extent, that is still reversible. Okay. If nag-swell pa ang cell, there's something that can still be done. If the mitochondria is swelling to a certain extent, that is still okay. If the rough ER is swollen or has been damaged to a certain extent, it can still be repaired. Okay, but when there is severe damage to the mitochondria, enough that it will cause leakage of the substances, the pro-apoptotic substances, or calcium, then the injury becomes irreversible. Okay? When there is leakage of lysosomal proteins, that is already irreversible. And when there is irreversible damage to the nuclear material, that becomes irreversible. So essentially, the cellular injury becomes irreversible if there is enough damage to the membranes, whether plasma membrane or the mitochondrial membrane, that leads to massive influx of calcium. So that's number one. Or when there is damage to the lysosomal membranes, leading to the release of proteolytic enzymes. So calcium and proteolytic enzymes, that is when the injury becomes irreversible. Okay. So this is a diagram leading to showing us how the cell becomes injured and how the cell tries to repair itself up to a certain extent. If di na niya kaya, then the cells are going to die, right? So that basically sums everything up for our discussion on cell injury. I'll see you in a bit for our talk on cell death. Thank you very much.